Je remercie le représentant de la Somalie pour sa déclaration. Je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Libéria.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I join in thanking the briefers for their qualified insights. Liberia takes the floor in a dual capacity. As an elected member of this council and as the world's leading flag state, representing over 300 million gross tons and 17% of global merchant shipping. We speak from the decks of targeted civilian vessels, on behalf of targeted civilian crews on the high seas, and an international economy straining under the weight of the war in Ukraine. Mr. President, in the strongest terms, Liberia condemns the strike on the LPG tanker Gas Lisbon in international waters, which killed one civilian seafarer and injured 3 others. We extend our deepest condolences to his family and our solidarity to the survivors. These mariners wore no uniform, no military uniforms, carried no weapons, and sought no combat. They were civilian workers keeping the world powered and fed. The subsequent damage to the bulk carrier Christiana B confirms that these attacks are no longer isolated incidents. They represent a systematic and concerning threat to global maritime commerce. Excellencies, attacks on merchant shipping are not merely tragic incidents. They are direct violations of international humanitarian law, breaches of International Maritime Organization safety norms, and a flagrant denial of the freedom of the high seas guaranteed under Article 87 of UNCLOS. When combat zones engulf international waters, the consequences do not stop at the Black Sea coast. More than 80% of global trade moves by sea. When maritime trade routes become shooting galleries, war risk insurance spikes, supply chains stall, and energy and food prices, as we have heard, surge. For developing nations, particularly across Africa, these translate directly into higher fuel prices at the pump, pricing of food on the family table, and an unjust tax on the developing world paid by ordinary citizens, most of whom cannot afford it. While the destruction within Ukraine and the expanding theater of the war is devastating, including to civilians and civilians' infrastructure, and in the deaths of civilian, and especially attacks, heartbreaking attacks against civilian infrastructure, its ripple effect on global food and energy security affects us all. This brings us, therefore, to the fundamental reality of this crisis. We view the persistent refusal to abandon military escalation not as strength, but as a fatal diplomatic intransigence, a tragic unwillingness to face the inescapable truth of this conflict. History offers us a stark, unyielding lesson. When this war finally ends, as all wars inevitably do, it will end at a negotiation table with mostly the same diplomatic interventions that are available to the parties today. The principles of sovereignty and international law will not change. The only difference between a settlement reached today and a settlement reached years from now is the intervening death, irreversible destruction, and wasted human life that no treaty can ever undo. Every day of delay, therefore, adds nothing to the ultimate compromise. It merely expands the graveyard. Excellencies, the world cannot afford an indefinite war of attrition, nor can we accept the premise that a lasting solution can be achieved on the battlefield alone. Military victories, as Liberia painfully learned, are fleeting and blood-soaked. A negotiated peace rooted in international law is sustainable and enduring. Under the leadership of the Democratic Republic of the Congo this month, this council has focused on Chapter 6 mechanisms for the peaceful settlement of disputes. That focus must now move from mere debates in this chamber to concrete action across global hotspots, including the war in Ukraine. Therefore, Liberia calls for an immediate, durable ceasefire, accompanied by urgent operational de-escalation, including demilitarized maritime safety corridors for commercial energy and green routes, and a renewed commitment to diplomatic talks. Specifically, Mr. President, Liberia urges all parties to, 1, agree to an immediate ceasefire and engage in direct high-level peace negotiations. 2, uphold international humanitarian law and UNCLOS Article 87 by guaranteeing the safety of civilian mariners and commercial vessels. 3, preserve unhindered freedom of navigation through established maritime safety zones in the Black Sea. And 4, cooperate fully with an impartial international investigation into attacks on civilian shipping. Mr. President, the oceans are the arterial system of global commerce and human survival. They must never become collateral victims of war. The Security Council, therefore, must act with unified resolve. Let us help silence the guns on land so that we may restore safety on the seas and deliver the peace that the international community demands, the people of Ukraine desire, and the people of Russia, I am sure, need. I thank you for your kind attention.
Je remercie le représentant du Libéria pour sa déclaration. Je vais maintenant faire une déclaration en ma qualité de représentant de la République démocratique du Congo. Plutôt, nous donnons la parole au Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Director Kayoko Goto and ASG Indrika Ratvite for their briefings. President, the continued conflict in Ukraine, particularly the escalation in intensity and frequency of attacks by the parties, is deeply concerning. We are also concerned by the reported attacks against infrastructure critical to global food and security, energy security. The ripple effect of such actions negatively impact lives and livelihoods far beyond the conflict zone, especially in the global south. Equally reprehensible is the harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure from the incessant fighting. We are alarmed by the reported targeting of humanitarian actors and associated infrastructure. President, we reiterate the call for all parties to fully abide by their international humanitarian law obligations. Violation of the widely accepted and well-established principles of IHL risks escalation, deepens mistrust, exacerbates human suffering, and further diminishes the prospect for peace. It is evident that durable peace and stability could only be achieved if the parties were to commit to an earnest, sustained, and meaningful dialogue. The quest for a military solution will only lead to more devastation, suffering, and consequences beyond the region. It is unfortunate that we are in this situation 17 months after the adoption of Resolution 2774 proposed by the US and supported by Pakistan and other council members. That particular resolution mourned the tragic loss of life. It reiterated the principle of peaceful settlement of disputes and implored a swift end to the conflict and urged a lasting peace between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. That resolution must be implemented. We therefore underscore the need for an immediate and complete cessation of hostilities, creating space for diplomacy and resumption of dialogue. A mutually acceptable, peaceful settlement consistent with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and corresponding to the legitimate security interests of all sides and the relevant multilateral agreements remains the only viable path. Pakistan will continue to support all endeavors aimed at achieving a just, comprehensive, durable, and peaceful resolution of this conflict. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant du Pakistan pour sa déclaration. Je vais maintenant faire une déclaration en ma qualité de représentant de la République démocratique du Congo. Distingués membres du Conseil, la République démocratique du Congo remercie Mme Kayoko Goto, directrice et responsable par intérim pour l'Europe, l'Asie centrale et les Amériques, au département des affaires politiques et de la consolidation de la paix, ainsi que M. Indrika Ratvite, sous-secrétaire général par intérim aux affaires humanitaires et coordonnateur adjoint des secours d'urgence au sein du Bureau de la coordination des affaires humanitaires pour leurs exposés. Les informations qui nous parviennent sur la situation en Ukraine demeurent profondément alarmantes, alors que les premières semaines de l'année 2026 semblaient laisser entrevoir une possible accalmie et nourrir l'espoir d'une sortie de crise. Les mois qui se sont suivis n'ont malheureusement fait que confirmer l'installation durable d'une poursuite de violence qui continue d'enregistrer son lot de victimes civiles. La République démocratique du Congo demeure vivement préoccupée par la poursuite et l'intensification des hostilités, malgré les appels répétés de ce Conseil à la désescalade et à la retenue. Force est de constater que la logique militaire continue de prévaloir sur les efforts politiques et diplomatiques, pourtant indispensables à un règlement durable de ce conflit. Cette évolution ne fait qu'aggraver les conséquences humanitaires de la guerre et accroître les souffrances des populations civiles. Les informations portées à la connaissance du Conseil au cours de ces derniers jours, tout comme les développements évoqués par nos intervenants, rappellent une fois encore l'urgence de mettre fin aux souffrances des populations meurtries et exténuées par plus de 4 années de guerre. La République démocratique du Congo exprime sa profonde compassion à toutes les victimes civiles de ce conflit et réaffirme sa solidarité avec les populations affectées auxquelles se trouvent. Nous saisissons également cette tribune pour rappeler que les populations civiles, au même titre que les infrastructures indispensables à leur survie, ne doivent jamais être prises pour cible et doivent pleinement être protégées conformément au droit international humanitaire. En effet, notre indignation ne peut être que plus vive lorsque les statistiques présentées par la mission de surveillance des droits de l'homme des Nations Unies en Ukraine font état d'une augmentation de 37% du nombre de victimes civiles au premier semestre 2026 par rapport à la même période en 2025. Ces chiffres illustrent avec force le coût humain grandissant du conflit et confirment que la poursuite de la logique militaire continue de frapper durement les populations civiles de part et d'autre de la frontière. Distingués membres du Conseil, réaffirmant son profond attachement aux buts et principes de la Charte des Nations Unies, ainsi qu'au respect du droit international et du droit international humanitaire, la République démocratique du Congo rappelle qu'il ne saurait y avoir de solution militaire à ce conflit. Chaque nouvelle offensive, quelle qu'en soit l'origine, prolonge le continuum de violence, accroît les souffrances humaines et éloigne davantage les perspectives d'une paix durable. Ma délégation renouvelle par conséquent son appel à la cessation des hostilités, à la protection effective des populations civiles, ainsi que des infrastructures indispensables à leur survie, et à l'instauration d'un cessez-le-feu susceptible de créer les conditions favorables à un véritable processus politique. La République démocratique du Congo demeure consciente de la diversité des perceptions qui entourent les origines, l'évolution et les responsabilités liées à ces conflits, et rappelle toutefois que cette pluralité d'appréciation ne devrait jamais conduire à la paralysie diplomatique. En effet, ma délégation maintient qu'une paix véritable ne pourra être atteinte que si les préoccupations de toutes les parties sont entendues et examinées avec responsabilité, discernement et bonne foi, dans le strict respect de la Charte des Nations Unies et du droit international. À cet égard, ma délégation souhaite rappeler que le débat de haut niveau, organisé récemment par le Conseil sous le thème « Renforcement des mécanismes de règlement pacifique des différends » dans le prolongement de la résolution 2788. Ce débat a opportunément rappelé que la Charte des Nations Unies met à la disposition des États un ensemble d'instruments de diplomatie préventive et de règlement pacifique des différends, notamment la négociation, la médiation, la conciliation, l'arbitrage et le règlement judiciaire dont le plein recours demeure plus que jamais nécessaire. La République démocratique du Congo appelle ainsi les parties à reprendre sans délai un dialogue franc, sincère, inclusif et conduit de bonne foi avec l'appui des Nations Unies et de tous les acteurs susceptibles de contribuer de manière impartiale et constructive au rapprochement des positions. Ces efforts doivent viser l'avènement d'une paix juste, durable et mutuellement acceptable dans le respect de la souveraineté, de l'indépendance politique et de l'intégrité territoriale des États, conformément aux buts et principes de la Charte des Nations Unies. Le Conseil de sécurité ne peut se limiter à constater périodiquement la dégradation de la situation. Il lui appartient de préserver les voies de la diplomatie, de soutenir les initiatives crédibles de médiation et d'encourager toutes les démarches susceptibles de favoriser une désescalade durable. En conclusion, la République démocratique du Congo demeure convaincue que seule une solution politique permettra de mettre un terme durable à ce conflit. Notre responsabilité collective est de faire taire les armes, d'interrompre la poursuite de violences qui frappent les populations civiles et de créer les conditions propices à une paix juste, durable et mutuellement acceptable. À cette fin, ma délégation continuera d'appuyer toute initiative crédible fondée sur le dialogue, la diplomatie préventive et le règlement pacifique des différends, conformément aux buts et principes de la Charte des Nations Unies. Je reprends à présent mes fonctions de président du Conseil. Le représentant de la France a demandé la parole pour faire une autre déclaration. Je la lui donne.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, nous fêtons cette année le 250e anniversaire des États-Unis. Et chacun sait la place que la France y a prise. Et il y a quelques jours, la Statue de la Liberté était illuminée, pas très loin d'ici. Nous avons particulièrement conscience de ce que c'est à San Francisco que la Charte a été adoptée et que les Nations Unies ont été créées avec pour objectif de travailler à la paix et la sécurité internationale, aux droits de l'homme, au développement. Tout cela, c'est l'esprit dans lequel la France travaille, aux Nations Unies, au Conseil de sécurité, à l'Assemblée générale, pour préserver cette institution, son indépendance, sa capacité d'action au service de la Charte, au service des droits de l'homme et au service de la paix. Dans l'enceinte qui nous réunit et dans le débat d'aujourd'hui, notre but, c'est de continuer à travailler avec tous ceux qui portent des initiatives de paix pour que l'Ukraine retrouve la paix, la sécurité, son intégrité territoriale, sa totale souveraineté. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie le représentant de la France pour sa déclaration. Je donne à présent la parole au représentant de l'Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Presidency of the Democratic Republic of the Congo for convening this meeting and the delegations of Denmark, France, Greece, Latvia, and the United Kingdom for supporting our request. I also want to thank to our distinguished briefers, Director Goto and Acting Assistant Secretary General Ratwater, for providing new evidence for the war crimes that were committed by Russian Federation against Ukrainian civilians. I would like to start my statement by quoting the famous words of Robert Jackson, the chief prosecutor for the United States at the Nuremberg trials. I quote, "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated." End of the quote. Yet, it seems that the international community still tolerates the repetition of heinous war crimes committed by the Russian Federation, which cynically fabricates pretexts to justify its illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. We've just heard from the Russian representative who manufactured artificial threats to mask Russian deliberate violations of international law. It seems that there are no limitations for Moscow and no red lines for the rest of the international community. During the night of July 18th and 19th, Russia launched the largest ballistic missile attack since the start of the full-scale military aggression against Ukraine. They used 41 missiles and 125 UAVs against Kiev and the Kiev region. Russian deadly strikes were also recorded in Kharkiv, Sumy, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. On July 23rd, a Russian bomb targeted the city of Pavlograd, the Dnipropetrovsk region, killing 3 and injuring 28 people. On July 24th, 3 Russian missiles killed 11 people and injured close to 100 in Kiev region. The same day, Russia struck and destroyed the building of the honorary consulate of Latvia in Slavyansk, Donetsk region, as was mentioned by briefers and our partners here. Last Friday, a Russian drone struck a supermarket in Chernihiv, killing 2 people, including a 10-year-old girl. 25 people were injured as a result of the attack. This was not an accident or collateral damage. It was yet another cynical and barbaric act of terror against civilians. Russia continues to deliberately target places where ordinary people live, work, shop, and it demonstrates utter contempt for human life. Mr. President, Russia continues to escalate its war of aggression against Ukraine, and this is an undeniable fact, as it was also confirmed by briefers. Recently, Russia has intensified a deliberate campaign against Ukrainian grain exports and is actively attempting to block maritime trade routes in Black Sea. By doing so, Russia wants to disrupt Ukraine's ability to export agricultural products, intimidate commercial shipping, and put pressure on global food markets. Since the beginning of Russian full-scale military invasion, at least 1,054 port infrastructure facilities have been damaged or partially destroyed. 232 civilian vessels have been damaged, and 307 civilians have been killed or injured as a result of Russian deliberate campaign of terror which targets Ukraine port infrastructure and civilian shipping. In June and July alone, Russia attacked almost 50 cargo ships. These attacks killed more than 30 people. The most recent and one of the gravest incidents occurred on 19th July, when 3 Russian cruise missiles struck the Guinea-Bissau flagged bulk carrier Golden Leo, owned by a Turkish company. The vessel was attacked while carrying Ukrainian grain through a maritime corridor. 10 people were killed, including a Ukrainian maritime pilot, while 8 crew members were rescued. The vessel posed no military threat. Yesterday, the Golden Leo sank off the coast to Odessa. On the same days, Russia attacked another foreign commercial vessel sailing under the flag of Antigua and Barbuda near Odessa, killing 1 crew member and injuring 3 others. Another civilian vessel under the flag of Republic of Marshall Islands was struck in the port of Odessa, leaving 4 crew members injured. Within less than 48 hours, Russia attacked 3 separate foreign merchant vessels operating near Ukrainian ports. Ukraine expresses its deepest condolences to the families and all seafarers and port personnel killed in these attacks. Russian attacks caused injuries among civilian seafarers from Ukraine, Egypt, Syrian Arab Republic, and India. Thus, such attacks have an impact on interests of many members of this organization. These facts are difficult to explain as coincidence or accident. These are deliberate actions. Since 22nd July 2026, maritime exports through Ukraine's ports have been suspended as a result of Russian attacks on civilian commercial vessels. The implications of this fact are obvious, and the timing of these attacks is particularly revealing. They are taking place at the height of harvest season, when millions of tons of Ukrainian agricultural products are expected to reach global markets. According to Ukrainian authorities, since the beginning of July alone, 31 merchant vessels have come under attack. Russia understands perfectly well what their consequences for such actions may have. More than 90% of Ukraine agriculture exports pass through Black Sea ports. Such attacks put the pressure on global food markets and increase uncertainty for countries that depend on Ukrainian agricultural export. And the consequences are felt far beyond Ukraine in Europe. Millions of families in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Middle East ultimately pay the price when the grain shipments are disrupted, transport costs increase, and commercial shipping becomes more dangerous. Mr. President, in 2022, with the help of the Secretary General Antonio Guterres and our Turkish partners, we established the Black Sea Grain Initiative. It made an important contribution to global food security. Russia later withdrew from the initiative unilaterally. Having taken that decision, it subsequently attempted to place responsibility on the United Nations and the Secretary General. We have categorically rejected such allegations. It's Russia who withdrew from the initiative by its own choice, disrupted a mechanism that benefited countries across multiple continents, and now questions the role of the institutions that helped make that mechanism possible. Delegations can assess these facts for themselves. Ukraine, in its part, expresses its full support for the Secretary General and his consistent position in defense of the Charter of the United Nations, international peace, and international security. We have launched the maritime corridor in the Black Sea in order to support these efforts, while Russia continues to target them with missiles and drones. One important fact should not be overlooked. Nobody is attacking Russian grain routes, striking Russian merchant vessels, or destroying its grain terminals. Ukraine implements its right to self-defense guaranteed by the UN Charter with the caution and respect for international law. Our forces attack only Russia's military potential and facilities which support Russia's war machine. We never wanted this war. When Ukraine strikes military airfields, military bases, ammunition, and fuel facilities that support Russian war effort, the war simply returns to where it originated. On the contrary, Russia attacks Ukrainian ports, grain terminals, and commercial vessels, and expects the international community to accept such terror. Russian terror against civilians and its threats to global food security must end. The United Nations must make full use of all appropriate tools at its disposal, including those provided by international law, to put an end to attacks against civilians, restore freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, and ensure the safety and security of seafarers who continue to suffer from these attacks. Defending freedom of navigation has long been a priority for the Security Council, and we take note of its recent initiatives and resolutions addressing these actions of destructive actors threatening maritime security on important international routes. The deteriorating situation in the Black Sea also requires the urgent attention and action without further delay. And we also would welcome those good offices that would help ensure Russia's full compliance with its obligations under international law, including the law of the sea. Mr. President, yet Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine extends far beyond the missile strikes, attacks against ports, or attempts to disrupt global food supplies. While the world sees burning ships in the Black Sea and destroyed apartment buildings in Ukrainian cities, tens of thousands of Ukrainians remain trapped behind prison walls in the temporarily occupied territories and inside Russian Federation itself. Their only crime was defending their country, refusing occupation, speaking Ukrainian, or remaining loyal to their homeland. 96% of released Ukrainian prisoners of war interviewed by the OHCHR reported torture or other forms of ill treatment. Nearly 90% reported conflict-related sexual violence. At least 109 Ukrainian prisoners of war have been executed after capture, while dozens more have died in custody. Civilian detainees have been subjected to the same machinery of abuse. Torture remains widespread and systematic. At least 182 civilians have been executed in areas under Russian control, including in places of detention. Many others never returned alive from captivity. The return of all our citizens is our paramount importance for us and the United Nations and the international community, and we should play an active role in this process. Every day spent in Russian captivity is another day of suffering that international law was created to prevent. The return of every prisoner of war and every illegally detained civilian, as well as unlawfully deported Ukrainian children, must remain an international priority until the last Ukrainian comes home. Mr. President, the picture that emerges from everything we have discussed today is remarkably consistent. Whether we speak about missile strikes against residential neighborhoods, attacks against grain terminals and merchant vessels, or torture chambers hidden behind the prison walls, we are dealing with different manifestations of the same policy. As Voltaire once famously said, those who can make people believe absurdities can make people commit atrocities. This is what Russian society is going through, and those responsible bear full responsibility for these war crimes. Moscow does not cherish the lives of its own citizens, as imperial ambitions remain at the top of its agenda. All efforts by Ukraine and our allies to restore peace have been met with escalation by Russia. Everything indicates today that Russia is preparing for a new wave of mobilization, destruction, and deaths. And as President Zelensky recently indicated, Russia wants 30,000 more troops from the DPRK to support the operation. Yet another demonstration of the Kremlin's regime malicious intentions was deranged by the history lesson delivered by Russia's ruler yesterday evening. His distorted understanding of history and the world, coupled with yet another attempt to shift blame for the regime's own crimes onto others, is far more than effort to justify Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. It is a diagnosis of an entire system that can survive only by feeding on bloodshed, suffering, and fear. Such rhetoric once again exposes the true nature of the Kremlin regime, one built on lies, violence, and imperial ambition. Thus, we call on our partners to put all efforts into real steps, which will restore comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. This requires increasing support for Ukraine, strengthening pressure on Russia, and further weakening its war capabilities. And we also echo the same request that was announced today by our partners. It's time for action, not deliberations. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Ukraine pour sa déclaration. Je donne à présent la parole à la représentante de l'Estonie.
Thank you, President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Baltic states. We align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. Now in the 5th year of its full-scale aggression against Ukraine, Russia shows no signs of abandoning its imperialistic objectives in subjugating Ukraine. Recent weeks have seen some of the most intensive aerial attacks since the full-scale invasion began. Combined missile and drone strikes hit cities across Ukraine, killing and injuring civilians and destroying homes, hospitals, schools, and other essential infrastructure. A Russian strike on a UNICEF warehouse in Bilohorodka destroyed humanitarian supplies worth nearly $4 million. On the 24th of July, a Russian strike destroyed the premises of Latvia's honorary consulate in Slovyansk, in clear violation of international diplomatic norms. We condemn these unlawful and typical attacks in the strongest possible terms. Unable to break Ukraine's resistance, Russia seeks to terrorize the population through intensified so-called human safari drone attacks near the front lines. Attacks against civilians and civilian objects, as well as indiscriminate attacks, are prohibited under international humanitarian law. Destroying essential infrastructure on which millions depend serves no legitimate military purpose. The same pattern is evident in the Black Sea. With the harvest season on the way, Russia is attacking grain-carrying civilian cargo ships, leaving dozens of international crew members from Egypt, Syria, India killed and injured. Deliberately disrupting Ukraine's maritime export corridor, Russia is targeting global food markets, raising risk of hunger for millions in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. We call on this Council and the wider international community to condemn these attacks and demand that Russia cease them immediately. We also express our solidarity with Romania for the repeated drone incursions into their airspace. Russia's reckless behavior needs to stop. Mr. President, Russia's armed and security forces have been repeatedly listed in the annexes to the Secretary General's reports for grave violation against children and are now also listed for conflict-related sexual violence, following the verification of 310 cases of such violence against Ukrainians. Security Council Resolution 2242 welcomed the Secretary General's decision that all countries repeatedly listed in the annexes to his reports are prohibited from participating in UN peacekeeping operations. Forces repeatedly implicated in these abuses cannot credibly protect vulnerable populations under the UN flag. We urge the Secretary General to apply this decision consistently and the Council to uphold and implement its unanimously adopted resolution. We urge Russia to immediately end the indoctrination and militarization of Ukrainian children and ensure the return of all those unlawfully deported and forcibly transferred. We also urge Russia to release all Ukrainian prisoners of war and unlawfully detained civilians and ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all those in need, including in Ukraine's temporarily occupied territories. Every victim deserves justice, and Russia's actions must be met with accountability. We support the International Criminal Court and the swift establishment and operationalization of the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. We call on all member states to support and assist the ICC and the Special Tribunal in their mission to fight impunity, bring justice to victims, and prevent future international crimes. The Baltic states reiterate their call for an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire as the first step towards a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, grounded in the UN Charter and international law. Such peace cannot be imposed upon Ukraine or reward aggression. We will continue to stand with Ukraine and reaffirm our unwavering support for its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de l'Estonie pour sa déclaration. Je donne à présent la parole à M. Quentin Weiler de la délégation de l'Union européenne auprès de l'Organisation des Nations Unies.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I have the honor of delivering this statement on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as Andorra, align themselves with this statement. I thanked the DRC presidency for convening this meeting, and I thank the briefers for the factual updates. The death and destruction caused by Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine continues unabated. The UN has verified over 2,000 civilian casualties in June alone, the highest in 4 years. Almost all occurred in Ukraine's urban centers as a result of Russian aerial bombardments. While the world demands a ceasefire and negotiations, Russia responds with brutal attacks against Ukraine's cities and their population. Last week, it destroyed Latvia's honorary consulate in Sloviansk, and as others in this room, I express full solidarity with Latvia. We are now also seeing a trend of attacks against humanitarian workers, bringing relief to people living close to the front lines. By every standard is it set for itself, Russia is not achieving its objectives. It spends 40% of its budget on its military and security. It has suffered over 1 million casualties for minimal territorial gains. It stands isolated internationally, and its economy is under heavy strain. The fact that this cynical brutality against civilians is now fueled by Russians' desperation with its failure on the battlefield excuses neither its inhumanity nor its blatant violations under international law. In fact, it compounds them both. The EU continues to stand firmly in defense of international law as enshrined in the UN Charter. We will continue to support Ukraine in exercising its inherent right to self-defense under Article 51 of the Charter. We have mobilized over 200 billion euros to this end, all in response to an illegal invasion by a permanent member of this Council. We continue to call for a full, unconditional and immediate ceasefire, as well as a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, based on international law, including the UN Charter. We call on Russia and its ally Belarus to immediately ensure the safe and unconditional return of all unlawfully deported and transferred Ukrainian children. We urge all countries, including the members of this Council, to cease any assistance or diplomatic cover to Russia, whether direct or indirect. Colleagues, Russia cannot succeed in changing borders by force or in escaping accountability for its actions. The sooner Russia realizes this, and the sooner it ends its aggression and comes to the negotiating table, the sooner this senseless cycle of death and destruction has a chance to end. We urge all members of this Council to work with us in pressuring Russia to do so and to ensure full accountability for war crimes and the other most serious crimes committed in this war of aggression. The time for a ceasefire is now. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie M. Weiler pour sa déclaration. Je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Pologne.
Monsieur le Président, I thank the Democratic Republic of the Congo for convening this meeting. I'll also thank the briefers for their informative presentations. Despite heavy losses on the battlefield and mounting economic problems, Russia remains unwilling to end its war of aggression against Ukraine. On the contrary, it systematically targets Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, causing civilian casualties and depriving thousands of people of access to essential services. Last week, Russia added the honorary consulate of Latvia in Sloviansk to the deliberate targets of its strikes. Poland condemns these actions in the strongest possible terms and calls, yet again, on Russia to stop the war. The recent escalation of Russian attacks against Ukraine's Black Sea ports and commercial vessels is already disrupting maritime traffic and poses a serious threat to Ukraine's export capacity, particularly with regard to agricultural products. These deliberate attacks undermine not only Ukraine's economy, but also global food security and the fundamental principle of freedom of navigation. Poland strongly condemns the recent drone incursions into Romanian airspace. Russia's provocations, especially across the eastern flank of NATO, from Estonia through Poland to Romania and other allies, are clear violations of international law. Mr. President, this Council has repeatedly heard Moscow's narrative about the alleged root causes of the war and its so-called legitimate security concerns. These are propaganda slogans that bear no resemblance to reality. It is time to stop repeating these narratives and instead focus on the facts. Ukraine was not a NATO member in February 2022, nor was its accession imminent. Claims that Ukraine or NATO pose a threat to Russia's sovereignty were never supported by the strategic realities preceding this invasion. Indeed, when one listens to Russia's bizarre justification for this war, it becomes increasingly difficult to understand what really objectives Moscow claims to be pursuing. Its explanations are detached from reality. We therefore call on all members of this Council to reject these false narratives and remain guided by the facts. And the fact is that Russia's revisionist neo-colonial policy long predates 2022. For years, Moscow has sought to preserve a sphere of influence over its neighbors through military aggression, coercive diplomacy, economic pressure, cyber operations, and disinformation. This is not the behavior of a state acting in self-defense. This is the behavior of a state pursuing domination and imperialism. Russia's rhetoric about the legitimate security concerns reflects its outdated imperial mindset rather than any genuine response to an immediate threat. It is Russia that has become the principal source of insecurity in Europe. The only way to address the so-called root causes of this war is for Russia to change its own policy. In the meantime, Ukraine has an inherent right to defend itself against Russia, as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Mr. President, the path to peace is clear. It requires pressure on Russia by the international community, including the members of this Council, so that Russia finally engages in meaningful negotiations. We call on all the United Nations member states committed to peace, international law, and the Charter to strengthen these efforts. And I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Pologne pour sa déclaration. Il n'y a plus d'oratrices ou d'orateurs inscrits sur la liste. La séance est levée.